LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, why the course of human history is not set in stone. Coming out of the most combative election we've seen in generations, the question many of us are asking ourselves is, can we all get along? Is our democracy working? Is it possible to sustain collaborative large-scale democracies that attend to everyone's needs? I, for one, feel a little discouraged in this moment, but I'm reminded of an uplifting conversation I had with David Wengrow about his extraordinary 2021 book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, which he co-wrote with the late anthropologist and anarchist David Graeber. To understand this conversation, you need a little backstory. For decades, anthropologists have maintained that social evolution went like this. First, we were hunter-gatherers living in small, blissful, nomadic bands. Everyone was equal, everyone was free. Then the story goes, we figured out farming, and things went downhill. Populations swelled, cities took shape. Food surpluses made possible artisans and armies and emperors. Before you knew it, we had stratified societies in which the ruling class subjugated the working class. But what if this social evolution was not inevitable? What if the large-scale societies that emerged millennia ago could have been organized in totally different ways? What would that mean for our understanding of history, for our hopes for the future? These are the contrarian questions posed by the Davids. It is clear, they write, that the world of hunter-gatherers, as it existed before the coming of agriculture, was one of bold social experiments, resembling, I love this, a carnival parade of political forms. They add, agriculture did not mark an irreversible step towards inequality. In fact, many of the first farming communities were relatively free of ranks and hierarchies. And from this, they conclude, quote, the course of human history may be less set in stone and more full of playful possibilities than we tend to assume. I'm returning today to the conversation I had with David Wengrow, who teaches archeology at University College London, because in light of what happened this week, the questions he and I discuss feel newly relevant. Can we look to the past to understand our contemporary discord? Do playful possibilities for the future still exist? I like to think so. And if they do, how do we bring them about?
If you're interested in the story behind the business headlines, check out Big Technology Podcast, my weekly show that features in-depth interviews with CEOs, researchers, and reformers in business and technology. Hi, I'm Alex Kantrowitz. I'm a longtime journalist, CNBC contributor, and the host of the show. I empty my Rolodex every Wednesday to bring you awesome episodes, so go check out Big Technology Podcast. It's available on all podcast apps. We'd love to have you as a listener.
Searching for the perfect place to grow your company? Whatever you're looking for, you can expect it, and so much more in Ohio. Partner with Jobs Ohio, and we'll connect you to the best sites, earlier funding, and top industry talent. Get started today at jobsohio.com.
David Wengrow, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Very good to be here.
Well, it's wonderful when books can spark dialogue and discussion across communities and countries and the world. And it must be gratifying to watch The Dawn of Everything become one of those books that does so. And in my own life, and I imagine for many listeners, the first book that really sort of I felt compelled to discuss with other people was Guns, Germs, and Steel, published in 1997, 25 years ago. It sold 1 million copies, which at the time was just an enormous number. It still is. And I think to some degree of The Dawn of Everything as part of this sequence of big stories about our origin story. Then Sapiens came out 10 years ago, 2011. It sold over 12 million copies, which is just stunning.
Did it really?
Yeah, which to me is kind of hopeful, right? I mean, the sense that people have such a deep desire to understand where we've come from, and so many readers are willing to engage with pretty serious and heavy subject matter. Now your book comes along, the size and weight of an anvil, 700 pages long, nearly 200 pages of endnotes, and it's flying off the shelves. How do you explain it? Do you think it's about this need we have for origin stories, or maybe we're orphans trying to figure out where we came from?
Well, not meaning to be flippant, but it may be the endnotes. I remember David telling me once, and of course he'd been around this block before with books like Debt. And one thing he'd learned from that experience is that people love endnotes. Who knew? Academics don't like endnotes very much, but people generally seem to like them. But I can't explain it other than by maybe just reflecting a bit on the fact that from my own field of archeology, which after all is that is the primary field if you're interested in 95% of human history. If you're interested in the evidence as opposed to just philosophical speculations of one kind or another, archaeology it's the go-to subject. And for whatever reason, people in my field, it's not that they've stopped writing popular books, there are many of them, but they tend to be focused on a specific region or period of history. They tend to be quite empirical in the sense that they're grappling with a particular phenomenon like Stonehenge or the ancient Celtic migrations. There haven't really been books coming out of my field which bring readers up to speed on just what we've been finding out over the last 30 or 40 years, which is pretty incredible. And it was often a surprise to David, who after all, his career is in a neighboring discipline.
Yeah.
I mean, some people even regard archaeology as a kind of branch of anthropology. And he was a very, very curious guy, a very widely read guy. And quite often I'd tell him about stuff and he'd go, I didn't have a clue about this, because it just stayed locked up in the scientific journals. There may be a fleeting headline here or there, but the work of synthesis, of pulling it together and just asking, what does all this new evidence do to some of our most entrenched, ingrained ideas about what our species is, what our capacities are as a species, and how looking at the past changes our understanding of those kinds of questions. And perhaps that's the gap. I'm speculating here, but maybe the dawn of everything has walked into some of that void.
It's a surprisingly cheerful book. And cheerful, I think, because it resists the temptation to suggest that there's an inevitability to the course of human history, which as you point out, some of these other books that came up, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and even Sapiens, have this tendency to assume that technology or some kind of inevitable sequence of stages of history is a teleological force that's driving the society.
Yeah, you get the sensation that our ancestors, they don't so much discover things as stumble into them, and then they spend thousands of years trying to figure out the consequences.
That's right, and it leaves us with the sense that we're sort of stuck. And it seems that part of why the dawn of everything is generating the response it is that it's kind of liberating. It says, wow, we're this playful species. The history is so much more complex and variegated than previously described.
And also that it's not just material technologies. A lot of the book is about social experimentation, which I think we tend to regard as something special to us or relatively modern thing. But actually, in many ways, when you look at the broad sweep of history and when you look at the evidence of archaeology and anthropology, we're actually rather less good at it than many of our ancestors seem to have been. I mean, what we consider to be radical really doesn't look that radical compared to the kind of things we can show happening in societies going back over thousands of years.
It's a wonderful thing to discover for at least for this reader, and I think for many readers. Well, let's get into it, starting with big idea number one. It's time for a new history of humankind.
In this book, we will not only be presenting a new history of humankind, but inviting the reader into a new science of history, one that restores our ancestors to their full humanity. Rather than asking how we ended up unequal, we will start by asking how it was that inequality became such an issue to begin with. Then gradually we will build up an alternative narrative that corresponds more closely to our current state of knowledge. If humans did not spend 95% of their evolutionary past in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers, what were they doing all that time? If agriculture and cities did not mean a plunge into hierarchy and domination, then what did they imply? What was really happening in those periods we usually see as marking the emergence of the state? The answers are often unexpected and suggest that the course of human history may be less set in stone and more full of playful possibilities than we tend to assume.
Okay, so you see our current understanding of the history of humankind as a myth. And we know it's a myth because it's too neat. It can be summed up in just a few sentences.
That's right.
Can you share with us that myth?
I'm tempted to ask you to do it because I've done it so many times now. And of course, if it's true, anyone should be able to do it. Here we go. We started out in tiny bands of egalitarian hunter-gatherers, and then something went terribly wrong, and look where we are today. And then we can debate the something. Was it the agricultural revolution? Was it the invention of cities? But that's basically it. I mean, as you say, it's such a simple. It's what Claude Lévi-Strauss called it, like a mytheme, like a little bundle of things that kind of sit in your head, and you repeat them so often that you never really question them.
You write, the world of hunter-gatherers, as it existed before the coming of agriculture, was one of bold social experiments, resembling a carnival parade of political forms. I love that. Far more than it does the drab abstractions of evolutionary theory. So the reality, it was much more colorful.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the archaeological evidence of what human beings were up to before the coming of, say, rice farming in East Asia, or maize growing in the Americas, or wheat and barley in Eurasia. Wherever you look, you see an incredible range of not just experiments, but actually things that we wouldn't otherwise. I mean, if there wasn't direct archaeological evidence for these things, we'd never imagine that pre-agricultural peoples were getting together in their thousands to build enormous earthworks and great monumental centers like Poverty Point in Louisiana, or the great stone monuments of Göbekli Tepe in the Middle East. These are just things that wouldn't really occur to us, but they're there in the archaeological evidence. You know, in Ice Age Europe, you have these phenomenal burials of individuals going back tens of thousands of years before the invention of agriculture, where people's bodies are placed in these kind of, they're almost like funerary dioramas with huge amounts of wealth and ornamentation and sophisticated, highly crafted objects and trade goods. All of this exuberance just gets flattened out in the conventional story, where we're told time and again that before the coming of agriculture, nothing much happened. In fact, what archaeology shows us today is that a huge number of different things happened, and many of those experiments will have involved institutions and beliefs that we generally think of as much more recent in time, including forms of private property, hierarchy, probably even slavery.
Jared Diamond called the agricultural revolution the worst mistake in the history of the human race.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's, it obviously strikes a chord in many ways, because you can go around the world sort of pointing the finger at agriculture in various ways and saying, well, if we didn't do all these things, we'd be in a much better position. On the other hand, it's also clearly, a very familiar, basically biblical, it's part of the Judeo-Christian tradition that there is this moment which is kind of a fall from grace.
Yeah.
So it resonates as an idea. And I mean, that's the thing about powerful myths, is that they're not actually divorced entirely from science and fact. In the two can blur into each other. And what really struck us, David and I, as we got further into this project, which we originally conceived as being really about the roots of social inequality. And there was a lot of literature at that time. This was the decade directly after the financial crisis, 2008-9. A lot of books coming out about inequality. Each of them was very rigorous, and each of them had its own take, but they all have a structure, a kind of narrative underpinning them. And the narrative doesn't really change. And it's that same story about how once upon a time everything was different, then something happened technologically to change all of that, and nothing could ever work the same way again. So we get this picture of humanity, going through these very rare and occasional and wrenching transitions, and then essentially nothing much happens for thousands of years. If you take that seriously as an account of human history, particularly in the present day, when by general consent we do need to make some changes to our cultural system just to remain on the planet, it's a fairly disheartening message. That in itself is not a reason to reject it, but when you begin to see that actually there's really nothing underpinning it, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, then I think you have a case to say, well, hold on, why do we keep repeating this stuff,
And so you write that there was, in fact, no switch from Paleolithic forager to Neolithic farmer. The transition from living mainly on wild resources to a life based on food production took something in the order of 3,000 years.
Yeah.
And while agriculture allowed for the possibility of more unequal concentrations of wealth, in most cases, this only began to happen millennia after its inception.
Yeah, this is not controversial in my field. If I'm sitting now on the 6th floor of the largest archeology institute in Western Europe, and if you go 3 flights of stairs down, you'll be in our archaeobotany labs, where there's a very brilliant, dedicated group of people who just study the flora, the ancient seed remains and other plant remains excavated from archaeological sites all over the world. And we now have a pretty good handle on the biology and the genetics of early plant domestication and early animal domestication. And it just doesn't fit this idea at all of once upon a time we were Paleolithic foragers and then everything changed. It's a much more interesting, but also more complex, not complicated, but complex story with a lot of regional variability. And it's a much slower story. What you say about thousands of years is exactly right. People are clearly taking the measure of farming and agriculture for very long periods of time, and for various reasons deciding not to go the full way with it. There's a technical term in the anthropological literature, low-level food production. In the book, we talk about play farming, because it's just a bit friendlier, but it's basically the same idea of people adopting elements of farming, but perhaps combining it with hunting, fishing, and foraging, can do that for centuries, taking up agriculture and then deciding to drop it again. That happens. There are numerous documented cases. What we certainly don't have anymore is that simple picture of a kind of linear progression with one set of social consequences. And particularly this idea that agriculture somehow inexorably gives rise to higher rates of inequality, or makes it harder to return to a pre-existing egalitarian condition. There's really no reason to think that. I mean, quite aside from the archaeology, there are many examples in history of agrarian societies that were highly egalitarian and didn't have systems of private property. If you look at South Asia or the Middle East, before the British showed up and imposed systems of private property and land enclosure in order to tax them. What you usually find in rural areas is something much more fluid, much more collective, perhaps based on what are sometimes called systems of usufruct, where nobody actually owns the land, but people have different rights in different parts of it and its products.
And one of the reasons that it seems there was this multi-thousand-year sort of flirtation with farming or dabbling in farming, play farming, as you say, is that people preferred the foraging lifestyle, it seems, right? And when presented with both lifestyles, it seemed to be the better choice. But playing the contrarian, isn't there some inflection point at which, the population density can no longer one just requires more land, right, to hunt and forage, and like clearly today there's no going back, right?
You could not sustain modern population levels without the kinds of systems of food production that we have. The question is how you organize those systems, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But was there not in some regions an inflection point where there was no going back simply because of population densities, and also then you have these armies made possible by those population densities and food surpluses? I mean, is there some point at which the kind of one-way street factor kicks in?
Well, except the armies would have been there before in many cases. I mean, it's this idea, slightly paradoxical idea, that adopting agriculture gave us the freedom to do other things, right? That before that we were so busy casting around looking for food and berries and nuts all the time that we didn't have time to have armies or invent writing or philosophy or civilization. This is an inherently strange idea. I mean, if you look at interviews that have been done with modern hunter-gatherers, they'll often look with pity at agriculturalists because they're just working all the time. It's really hard work. If you've ever done any farming, it doesn't actually leave you much time for anything. The idea that agriculture somehow liberated us to explore all these other possibilities doesn't really make much sense. It's not very logical. And again, it doesn't really fit the picture of what actually happened.
Do you, having spent so many decades studying and thinking about, no doubt, the lives of these people who lived in pre-farming days, do you have a sense of personal nostalgia for those days? And if you had a time machine, where would you take it?
No, I confess I've never wanted to be a hunter-gatherer, and part of the reason for that, and as we talk about in the book, is that many hunter-gatherer civilizations were really much more like ours than we might want to admit. We talk about the history of indigenous societies on the west coast of the Americas, California, and up to the northwest coast, which include societies that traditionally were highly ranked into aristocrats or nobles, commoners, and hereditary slaves. And then down in California, you have a long history of societies that were very oriented around wealth and money, which were also hunter-gatherers. So, even the idea of the hunter-gatherer as a thing, as a category, is really a bit odd. And it's worth asking the question, I think, how we ever came to divide human history up in that way, according to modes of livelihood or modes of food production. This isn't something you can find forever in the annals of history. It's something that comes in to European history and philosophy at a very specific point in time. Well,
in the absence of a choice to join a prior society, how about a vacation, David? If you were to take if I gave you a time machine, you could choose your date and your place, and you can spend a week with one of the cultures that you bring to life in your book. Where would you go?
I would just want to spend a week in one of these early Ukrainian cities, which go back about 5,000 or more years, where somehow they found a system, a way for people to live together in their many, many thousands. Most archaeologists would say tens of thousands, for long periods of time, without apparently having any kind of central organization or hierarchy. And they were clearly having quite a lot of fun too, because the material remains of domestic life and of family life in these early Eastern European cities are beautiful. I mean, they're incredible artistic creations, particularly in pottery and terracotta, just because it survives. But, imagine what they were doing with fabrics and fibers. Sure. It's almost like some magnificent, massive artist's colony. And wouldn't you like to go back and just see, how did they pull that off? I mean, these settlements in one form or another were around for about 7 or 8 centuries. So they had something figured out there that is very, very difficult for us today to grasp. And yeah, I would love to spend a few hours in whatever it was, an assembly or a council meeting in one of those local neighborhoods, just finding out how it all worked.
Yes, and I think I remember that in Nebelivka, I think they found ruins with households that were clustered together in groups of half dozen or more families with a common assembly house.
That's right.
And there's a sense of sort of communal living and very comfortable communal living. We have this great variety of forms of social organization in early cities, but we also have these communities that shift seasonally between one form of social organization and another. I found this absolutely fascinating.
Isn't it interesting?
There was even one example of a group that actually assumed different names.
Yeah.
Right, during the hunting season. Was it the Kwakiutl?
Yeah, they're still around. These are very much living people and societies. In this particular case, on the northwest coast, down from Alaska, you have societies who historically, before and still in the early phases of European expansion, they switched their societies around on a seasonal basis. In that particular area, a lot of it was to do with fishing and the annual seasonal fish runs. So they would move from the coast further inland at particular times of year. And the coastal sites, you would have these great settlements with big timber, wooden houses, totem poles, very ranked and hierarchical. And you would have these incredibly intense seasons of festivities and theatrical ceremonies and performances in which people would take on roles. And in the course of moving, they would change their social structure as well. And as you say, even take on different identities. I mean, the whole region there is famous for its art, and particularly its traditions of masking. It was very much a culture that explored the possibilities of costume, role-playing, and spirituality, and trickery. And yes, people would actually take on different identities in different seasons, become literally different people.
And I love this observation that when you have temporary authority, you don't want to overplay your hand, right? Because that's in another 6 months, you may be in a different position. And you all go on to point out that there are many examples, there are echoes of this throughout human history, this tendency to have festivals and occasions when the social order is turned upside down, and that all of this, you speculate, was part of a kind of playfulness around imagining different forms of social organization.
Yeah, the self-conscious aspect of that flipping, often between hierarchical and egalitarian forms, that alternation, is very, very clear. People know what they're doing, which also means they can imagine what it might be like to just live in one kind of society all the time.
I love your observation that we've traded play chiefs and real freedoms for real chiefs and play freedoms. We'll get to that, but before that, we should get into big idea number 2. It's time to look past the myths.
For far too long, we have been generating myths. As a result, we've been mostly asking the wrong questions. Were our earliest ancestors simple and egalitarian, or complex and stratified? Is human nature innocent or corrupt? Are we as a species inherently cooperative or competitive, kind or selfish, good or evil? Perhaps all these questions blind us to what really makes us human in the first place, which is our capacity as moral and social beings to negotiate between such alternatives. We do not have to choose anymore between an egalitarian or hierarchical start to the human story. Let us bid farewell to the childhood of man and acknowledge that our early ancestors were not just our cognitive equals, but our intellectual peers too. Likely as not, they grappled with the paradoxes of social order and creativity just as much as we do, and understood them just as much, which also means just as little. If there is a riddle here, it's this. Why, after millennia of constructing and disassembling forms of hierarchy, did Homo sapiens, supposedly the wisest of apes, allow permanent and intractable systems of inequality to take root?
If there's a star protagonist in the dawn of everything, it's Kandiaronk. Can you tell us his story?
Yeah, I can tell you a little of what I know, which is that he was a very famous member of the Huron-Wendat nation. He lived in the 17th century, and he actually died almost immediately after being one of the signatories of the Peace of Montreal, the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. But he was an individual who was famous as a warrior and as a diplomat who was deeply embroiled in negotiations with English, French, Dutch, and other colonists in the region of basically the Great Lakes, Huron, Michigan. He was also widely reputed to be not just a highly intelligent person, but an absolutely brilliant mind and a beautiful speaker. He was the speaker of his nation. And as a result of that, he was actually the honored guest frequently of the then French colonial governor of that region, who used to sort of bring him on for debates, like a little sort of proto-Enlightenment salon somewhere in the region of Montreal, to entertain his French officers with the wit and the exuberance of this man's conversation. He also is the basis for a fictional character by the name of Addario, who appears in one of these dialogues, which became very, very fashionable in Europe in the Age of Enlightenment, in the early and middle 18th century. People would write these dialogues with a savage, dialogues with an exotic interlocutor, and the role of the exotic person, whether it was a he or a she, would be to kind of reflect back on European civilization and often criticize European society and culture in ways that would have been difficult for Europeans themselves to do at that time. You get into trouble with the church or the state. Sure. The difference about Addario is that the writer who created him was actually a French colonist who lived in the Great Lakes region, learnt to speak at least two of the local native languages and dialects, and who we know was familiar with Kandiaronk, met Kandiaronk, attended some of these meetings, and then wrote down, together with the French colonial governor at the time, a man called Frontenac, who offered to help him, wrote down much of what he remembered. And much of it is this kind of scathing criticism of what Kandiaronk and many other indigenous intellectuals and indigenous observers made of European societies at the time. The difficulty comes with what to do with those texts, those dialogues. Many historians treat them as purely fictional creations. But one thing that we try to show in The Dawn of Everything is that many of the criticisms voiced by Kandiaronk of European civilization are completely consistent with other reports that we have, for example, from Jesuit missionaries about what local native people would say about the French, for example. So actually, if you take the trouble to find out a bit about what we know about the history of Iroquois-speaking people and nations at that time, much of it is highly consistent with what we find in the dialogues with Addario.
And as you say in the book, not only were these Native American leaders and people more broadly our cognitive equals, but they were our intellectual equals. It's so different from the version of history that we grew up with. And this idea that you had these extraordinarily eloquent and compelling orators among these Native Americans, I love, and it was Lahontan, I think, who penned this dialogue, curious dialogues with a savage of good sense who has traveled. I love these titles. And one of them, just to give one example for our listeners, was that Kandiarak makes this argument about the Christian God that all the Frenchmen bow down to, and said, if it were possible that God had lowered his standards sufficiently to come down to earth, wouldn't he have done it in full view of everyone? Wouldn't he have gone from nation to nation performing mighty miracles, thus giving everyone the same laws? Then we would all have exactly the same religion. Instead, there are 500 or 600 religions, each distinct from each other.
Well, what's so interesting is that it's actually the indigenous interlocutor who takes the role of the kind of rational skeptic.
Exactly.
This is meant to be the origins for us. We think this begins with Europeans going around the world looking at all these strange tribes and saying, "Oh my God, you guys are so weird and exotic." But actually, if Clifford Geertz and all those guys were right about the anthropological gaze, the Western gaze, which is meant to be this kind of skeptical, rational take on life, wouldn't it be funny and deeply ironic if it actually originates with indigenous people looking at these peculiar Europeans with their bizarre systems of religion and hierarchy and going, you guys are really, really strange,
Right. No, it's an extraordinarily incendiary suggestion, which I think you all, I think, coined the phrase the indigenous critique, right?
Yeah. And it's not over. I mean, you have to just look at what's been going on at the climate summit that we had in Scotland just recently. And the prevalence of indigenous perspectives and voices on what's happening to their environments. And of course, those are not the voices in the conference. Those are the voices on the street outside the conference. So we're still not listening.
And the extraordinary suggestion here is that it was this kind of feedback, this dialogue with Native Americans that helped plant a seed that contributed to Enlightenment thinking, which to refresh our memories was the Enlightenment, the 18th century. I think Kant said the motto was "Have courage to use your own understanding." The thinking was, let's use reason and logic and rationality to understand how the world works and propose ways of improving it. I mean, the extraordinary suggestion is that it was in dialogue with these new cultures of people who had more liberty, more freedom, and more open dialogue about ways of organizing humans that resulted in this Enlightenment thinking that in turn resulted potentially in the French Revolution, the American Revolution.
I mean, you have to look at the way that the history of the Enlightenment is usually written. It's usually written by people educated in European history, European languages, European civilization. They're likely to have a pretty firm grasp of the ancient world, which for them means Greece and Rome. And it's largely written as a history of people writing books, reading each other's books, writing a book about the book that somebody else wrote. And it's all about books, essentially, and often great men, great thinkers, great individual figures. In fact, it shouldn't really be extraordinary to suggest that Europeans, who, after all, at that time were highly mobile, I mean, there were Europeans going everywhere, marrying, trading, interacting with people everywhere from China to the Americas. The idea that they wouldn't have absorbed anything of intellectual or moral value from those encounters, that seems pretty extraordinary as a claim. And yet, when you make the apparently modest suggestion that actually encountering people for whom liberty and individual autonomy was not just an abstract concept or a theological concept, but was actually the basis of their social organization. Whole social and cultural systems founded on these principles. The idea that that wouldn't have had some impact on European people, including intellectuals at the time, that in itself seems like a pretty extreme claim. And yet, when people suggest that knowledge could have flowed in that direction, not just physical habits like, we know that Europeans adopted tobacco pipes at the same time, and the habit of sitting around having conversations while drinking caffeinated beverages. Nobody questions that Europeans adopted these cultural habits. But the idea that there might have been some intellectual influence, or that we might have learned something of social value, can still provoke almost a kind of hysterical backlash in the academy. I've seen a bit of it myself over the last few weeks. And you have to ask, why is it still so difficult for so many historians to accept the idea, just as you said before, that these people that Europeans were encountering were people, and among them were some brilliant people who intellectually were our equals, but also remember we're talking about either non-literate societies or societies that certainly didn't use writing for most of the things that Europeans used it for at the time. These are societies that were much more heavily invested in orality and spoken interaction for many of their legal traditions, their political customs. They had very, very highly developed cultures of debate and persuasion, which was actually the kind of logical consequence of not being able to invade someone else's freedoms. One of the things that really struck indigenous societies in that region of the northeastern woodlands region of the Americas about Europeans is how they were constantly taking orders and obeying them on, deferring to each other on the basis of rank and valuing each other in terms of property. It doesn't seem like there were any such mechanisms in these native societies at the time, which, if you think about the logical consequence of that, of being able to give orders but not being able to assume that anyone will obey you, the only logical alternative then is to actually talk people around, or as some of the Jesuit observers at the time put it, the chief only has power insofar as it is the power of his tongue, his power to persuade. So there really shouldn't be anything terribly surprising or shocking in the idea that Europeans encountering someone like Kandiaronk, who came directly out of that political and cultural milieu, would have been exactly what they described, deeply impressed and moved and motivated by the sophistication of what they were hearing.
The critical point you make here is that in these early encounters, it became, I'm quoting you here, it became clear to French observers that most indigenous Americans saw individual autonomy and freedom of action as consummate values, organizing their own lives in such a way to minimize any possibility of one human being becoming subordinated to the will of another.
It is like you said before, which perhaps you made it up, or perhaps it's in the book, is that they had real freedoms and play chiefs, whereas we have play freedoms and real chiefs. In other words, we pride ourselves on living in a democracy, but all you got to go and do is get a job, and before you know it, you're going to be scrambling around obeying orders all the time. Hierarchy is there from the schoolroom onwards, and we have to obey our chiefs because we find out pretty quickly what happens when we don't. Whereas the societies we've been talking about in the Americas, in that part of the Americas, they had chiefs too, but they really didn't have that kind of coercive authority. And the freedoms were very real. People were not allowed to impinge on the autonomy of others, including women's freedoms. The Europeans, particularly the Jesuits, were scandalized by the fact that women could get divorced at will, and had sexual freedoms as well.
Can we ever get back there? Is it possible to shrug off the hierarchies that are holding us down? After this short break, David shares his vision for a freer, more playful future.
You have one goal: find the perfect place to grow your company. You don't have time for empty promises, and at Jobs Ohio, we don't have time to make them. You deserve a partner who gets it, someone who understands your vision and the seamless path to sustainable growth. Expect this and so much more in Ohio, where you'll benefit from the best sites, earlier funding, and the top industry talent you've been searching for. Bring your business to Ohio and join our centuries-spanning tradition of movers and shakers. Get started today at jobsohio.com.
Welcome back to the show. David's first big idea is that the course of human history may be less set in stone and more full of playful possibilities than we tend to assume. His second big idea is that we need to abandon the myth that human history has been a straight march from egalitarian to hierarchical societies. Now, in his final big idea, he says the true history of civilization is only just starting to be written.
On reflection, there is just something odd about the way we use the term civilization today. One problem is that we've come to assume that civilization refers in origin simply to the habit of living in cities. Cities, in turn, were thought to imply states, but as we've seen, this is not the case historically, or even etymologically. The word civilization derives from Latin civilis, which actually refers to those qualities of political wisdom and mutual aid that permit societies to organize themselves through voluntary coalition. If mutual aid, social cooperation, civic activism, hospitality, or simply caring for others are the kind of things that really go to make civilizations, then this true history of civilization is only just starting to be written.
Well, you've said, David, that you did not write this book as an act of advocacy, but it's clearly a provocation. I think a well-timed provocation. It's interesting. A surprising number of my friends are taking very seriously right now the question of how we can better design our society and even our just individual collective families, right? And it feels to me like there are a few different factors at play. One is that there's this sort of epidemic of loneliness that's been talked about, and this may be partly to do with the erosion of religion, and maybe because of the building of edge cities and the automobile and the way that's impacted how we live. And we now know that humans live an extra decade longer if they're more connected with other humans. This is a really core need that we have. We then have this increasingly preposterous concentration of wealth issue. We have this looming because of artificial intelligence and roboticization, the prospect of mass loss of jobs in a cultural environment within which we're all in Western society very much defined by the work we do. So this is sort of threatens our dignity. Meanwhile, we have China defying what we thought was the inevitability that capitalism begets democracy. People are talking about using blockchain to create new systems of governance, right? Elon Musk is talking about the benefits of direct democracy on Mars when he sets that up. So
you make it all sound quite exciting, actually. I think the prevailing sense that I get from a lot of people is the opposite. It's a sense of being kind of stuck. I mean, it's interesting that you made the point about these rates of inequality. We hear a lot about the rates, we hear a lot of numbers, we hear a lot of figures. A certain percentage of the world's population control some huge proportion of the world's wealth, and the metrics get better and better and more accurate and more accurate. But it's almost as if the more we're able to measure these things, the less we're able to actually do anything about them or think about doing anything more dramatic than, maybe just slightly bringing them down a little bit, but not actually questioning the underlying logic, the underlying system that produces those inequalities in the first place. The quality of political discourse seems to have eroded to the point that even when you're confronted with these really, really stark figures, there's just this sense that it was all inevitable. And yeah, fair enough. This definitely got our goat when we started seeing colleagues of ours in our fields of ancient history, archeology, getting on board with this kind of idea that it not only is it all inevitable, but it's somehow rooted in human evolution and human social evolution, that it's all somehow a natural consequence of processes going back thousands and thousands of years. And lo and behold, when you scrape the surface, what's underpinning that idea? Well, it's the same old stories and fables that were being told hundreds of years ago, back in the days of the Enlightenment, by people who didn't want to listen to what we've called the indigenous critique or other critiques of the cultural system that was taking form at that time.
The question of equality versus freedom comes up quite a bit in the book. And you say that you felt the need to come up with your own more neutral list of baseline human freedoms.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you want to speak a little bit about what those
Yes.
are and what you think, what this might look like? I mean, what can we do to get unstuck?
What do we mean by freedom? Is it just this kind of abstract principle like, liberty, equality, fraternity? What do these words mean in practice? Where do we actually see them enacted in our lives? And in the book, we look at examples of societies that had real freedoms, the kind you could actually put into practice. Societies where people were not trained into obedience. And three particular things came into focus. The first is to do with mobility, simply the freedom to decide that you don't like where you are and to move away and escape your surroundings in the expectation. Again, this is not a purely individual freedom because it's always in the expectation that at your point of destination, somebody will take you in and receive you. We talk about these clan systems that existed in different parts of the world. There are examples in Oceania, in North America, where people could leave their homes and their families and move over very long distances, hundreds of miles, in the full knowledge that a co-member of their clan would take them in, adopt them, make them part of their family. And this is borne out in the archaeological evidence too. What you get before the appearance of cities are not these isolated little bands of human beings. You get these great, we ended up calling them sort of hospitality zones, these networks of small societies that people seem to have been very free to move between them, which implies that they're being received, they're being taken in, they're intermarrying, whatever it may be. So this freedom to move away and start a new life somewhere else. The second basic freedom is something we've already touched on in our conversation, is simply the freedom to disobey arbitrary commands, again, with an expectation that you won't be excluded or ostracized or killed or imprisoned, but will be listened to, debated. This was the basis of those cultures of discussion and debate that we talked about earlier, and participatory forms of democracy. And the third basic freedom we identify, very much based on the first two, is the freedom to just reimagine and remake one's society in a different form. And what we suggest is that kind of freedom, which I guess is epitomized in those kind of seasonal alternations that we talked about. It's a very extreme example of people who construct one kind of society at one time of year and then on a routine basis just kind of disassemble it, take it apart, put it back together in some different form, and then do it again and do it again and do it again. It's an extreme example, but the basic principle, we feel, if human civilizations have lost something, if there is something to be nostalgic about or sort of hark back to, it's not equality, it's not living in a society of equals, because there's no particular reason to think that ever happened. It's precisely that ability to reconceptualize society itself and collectively to decide to do things differently. That's what we seem to have lost.
These acts of playing with alternative forms of social organization, I think of Burning Man, as one sort of act of collective play, which huge oversight, David. I've never been to it, but but I intend to.
Neither.
I intend to go. If you want to go next year, I'm in. I'd like to go.
Is it happening next year?
I don't know. But if it does, but we think of these as just sort of fun festivals. But I think you might make the case, perhaps, that when people self-organize for a couple of weeks, and that proves to work for tens of thousands of people or more, that we should take these moments somewhat seriously as experiments that could be expanded upon.
Well, it's obviously something that my co-author David Graeber had a huge amount of experience with, because unlike me, he was a practical activist. He'd played a role in Occupy and the global justice movement, where people were debating exactly these kinds of issues. And actually, one of the things he talked to me a lot about when we started writing and thinking together was exactly how often people would object, would come up with the objection. Even people who were sympathetic to what was going on with Occupy would come back with the objection that it could never work on a large scale. So clearly, it's of interest to be able to document. For example, we talked earlier about those early Ukrainian cities, examples in history of societies that do actually manage to organize without steep hierarchies on a large scale. It does have a contemporary significance. It does have a political significance. But there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a truism. You teach your students in the first year of an archeology or a history degree that if you think you can write history from some sort of elevated, completely neutral, objective standpoint, you're in cloud cuckoo land. We all have to be aware of our context, and it's out of that context that certain questions arise, and you go to the data with those questions.
This reminds me of some of the reviews of the book I've read that refer to you and David as anarchists. And popular culture is not especially kind to anarchists. The word conjures up piercings and tattoos. But then I look at the author photos on your book jacket, and it's two guys in collared shirts. So I have to ask you, are you, David,
what
an
were
anarchist?
You expecting? I personally, and I suspect this might be a good anarchist position. It's not for me to say, but I don't like pigeonholes. I don't like pigeonholing people. I don't like sticking labels on people. Maybe that makes me a good anarchist, but that would be a kind of self-defeating argument, wouldn't it?
Well played. In the last paragraph of the book, you talk about participatory democracy as natural, that's something we've conceived of as natural in small groups, but something that cannot possibly scale up to anything like a city or a nation state. And I think this is a perception that you're rectifying in the book. Do you see more participatory democracy as part of the direction in which we need to head? I know you've avoided specific prescriptions in this book itself, but on a personal level, where do you see, what kind of aspects of our contemporary society do you think need to change in our form of governance?
I think you can already see examples going on all over the world of people doing this. The one that's closest to home for me, some of the initiatives happening around climate change, which is such a long-term issue, but at the same time impinges so much on the local and small decisions people have to make about how to heat their homes and how to light their streets, whatever it may be. And there's already lots of examples of people taking those decision-making processes out of the short-term cycle of political elections, where it's politicians doing the talking, politicians who are thinking about their next electoral race and who's going to vote for them, taking it out of those short-term cycles and putting it in the hands of local assemblies, which are selected much like people do jury service on a random basis, so that you get a cross-section of the population. It's not just one interest group. And it takes a lot of time, and people have to sit around talking, debating, disagreeing, but ultimately trying to arrive at some kind of consensus. It's just one example, but I'm sure there are many, many more.
one thing I've noticed in business is I've moved, building some, small digital media companies in the last couple decades. I've moved to more of this approach of persuading people rather than sort of top down, decision making. So I have a friend who's a pretty senior guy at Google who was interested to learn when he joined the company that the cultural expectation is that it is incumbent upon the leader of each team to persuade the team that his or her opinion or direction is the right one. That there's not, you don't just sort of, instruct everyone because of your position of authority to follow a certain path. And I think there's been a movement in business anyway, I don't know as much in our governance, towards these sort of somewhat more egalitarian approach to how one goes about making decisions. There's greater respect for the views of interns and younger members of the team, and that one has to persuade, much as Kandiaronk might have done.
Well, you're reminding me. There's a debate, quite a famous debate, that took place between David Graeber and what's his name, the guy who invented PayPal, Thiel, right?
Oh yes, Peter Thiel. Yeah,
Peter Thiel. And I watched it actually the other week for the first time, and it's fascinating. And there's a point in the conversation where Thiel says something along the lines of, he's kind of agreeing with David about the need to do away with some of these dogmas about what does and doesn't work in groups of various sizes. But then he puts the question to David. He says, all right, but your kind of decentralized way of organizing things, could that get people to the moon? Could that cure cancer? Could that give us mobile phone? Give me some examples of decentralized organization that have actually done anything, like, in terms of technology or cultural, etc.
Could you do the Manhattan Project? Could you could you do Apollo? Could you get someone to the moon in a radically decentralized, chaotic system? Or do you need coordination and planning?
Radically decentralized. Yes, you do need coordination and planning. Frankly, I don't think that creating very large scale but fundamentally democratic structures historically is that hard. I think it's really hard to create tiny structures that are democratic. You can get very large structures that work that way and coordinate things. What you don't get so much are egalitarian families, small scale structures. That's what's actually much, much trickier.
And you can see sort of David's brain whizzing around, and then the conversation turns to something else. And it occurred to me that 10 years later or whatever, the answer in The Dawn of Everything is, well, yeah, most of human history was done that way. Most of the great technological discoveries of human history were not done with some guy on top telling everybody directly underneath him to tell those other guys what to do. It's just not true. So it's one of those questions that when you're confronted with it in the present moment, your mind goes blank and you think, oh, could we really do it? But it's actually one of those cases where big history, or taking the broad sweep of history, actually doesn't make you feel small and insignificant. It actually makes you realize, people have done incredible things in different ways. They've created systems of navigation that got our species to Australia.
Extraordinary, yeah.
They've created cities without locking themselves into these rigidly hierarchical command structures and systems of management. So in a way, one could argue that one strand of our book is a very, very long answer to Peter Thiel's question.
Well, I love this question that you ask in the book. What if we treat people from the beginning as imaginative, intelligent, playful creatures who deserve to be understood as such?
What a radical suggestion, huh?
What a radical suggestion.
Only an anarchist could possibly conceive of anything so crazy.
Well, I think the rehabilitation of Kandiaronk as the incredibly compelling historical figure that he was, is a wonderful piece of this. And I have to think right now somebody's pitching a movie based on Kandiaronk as protagonist, and I think it should open with Lahanson penniless in Amsterdam.
Oh, you thought this through.
Drafting this through. I maybe one of our listeners will run with that and engage you as a
who would you who would you cast as Lahanson?
Oh boy, what a field day. I leave that to you.
I'm not going to ask you who you'd cast as Kandiarong, because that's an incendiary question.
Yes, well, both great roles, and I don't know. I have a hunch this may come to pass. David, this book was meant to be the first in a series of 4. Now, sadly, you've lost your co-author and your dialogic sparring partner. Have you given any thought to whether you'll continue the project?
No, because I'm very conscious of not being in a place right now where I can make a decision about that. I'm really just trying to keep up with the overwhelming power of the response to this book, which every so often, actually very often, on a almost daily basis, I see a response to the book that sets me off on a certain train of thought. And if I had a month locked up in a library, I could probably follow that train of thought. But what I try to do, and I don't, but what I try to do is just collect ideas that seem important to me at the time, stop them from running away. Much as David and I basically started creating an archive. When we'd have a conversation and something interesting came out, one of us would write it down, it would go into the archive and it would stay there. And I'm basically still doing that. And maybe over time, certain things will come into focus that I feel I can cope with and explore either by myself or with other collaborators. But no, I'm not really at the point of making any decisions about that.
Well, I hope you are planning to visit some of the beautiful places you describe in the book. I think I've heard you say that's something you aspire to do.
Very much so.
And after you do, we hope you'll come back and tell us what you learn. We've so enjoyed speaking with you today. Thank you, David, for taking time out of your teaching and writing and archaeological excavations to be with us today.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Would you like to hear 2 more big ideas from The Dawn of Everything? Or maybe you'd like a 12-minute version of the book that you can share with friends. Download the Next Big Idea app and check out David's Book Bite. And don't stop there. In our app, you'll also find beautiful audio and video e-courses, conversations with our curators, and audio summaries of new and classic books. Search for Next Big Idea in your app store. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to listen to our conversation with Rutger Bregman called Humankind, Finding Hope in Human History, or with Lydia Denworth about the evolution of friendship, or with Christopher Ryan about what we can learn from our hunter-gatherer ancestors. You can find links to those episodes in the show notes. And if you like The Next Big Idea in general, please leave us a review and a 5-star rating if you think we've earned it. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the Next Big Idea app, or wherever you're listening right now. Many thanks to David Wengrow and the late David Graeber for this brilliant book. This episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. See you next week. Don't you think, David, this would be a great movie?
I can imagine it. I can imagine about a zillion ways it could be done really badly, and then there's probably 1 or 2 ways in which it could be an amazing movie.
Well, I think La Hontan is also such a fascinating character, isn't he? I mean, you just imagine.
I was thinking Brad Pitt for La Hontan.
Okay. I'm sure.
Or DiCaprio, maybe.
Yes, I could absolutely see DiCaprio. I mean, either of them would be lucky to get that role. It's a wonderful
It'd be a fun role.